Indie games, a cornerstone of the gaming industry that's given us some of the most innovative and unique games to date. With a huge influx of indie games popping up in recent years, the top 8% of them somehow manages to occupy a bigger and bigger share of the market with every passing year, and I was led to one key question that I set out to answer. What makes an indie game good? Now, I've played my fair share of indie games, Hollow Knight, Celeste, Undertale, but I just can't seem to put my finger on what makes my favourites feel different from the others. To try and get a fair view on what makes some of the games way more popular than their competitors, I came up with a list of 5 different elements that I think can be considered to be the most important components to any successful game. The list includes gameplay, replayability, music, story and art style as the 5 main categories that most successful indie games excel in. Now, I know that's a pretty broad list, but I'll go into more detail about how each of them lead to a game being successful, and examples of games that do really well in each area. Let's start with the most obvious one, the gameplay. At the end of the day, if a game isn't enjoyable to play, then everything else doesn't really matter. The core gameplay is crucial to a great indie game experience, and a lot of the time is where some of the most innovation that I mentioned before happens. For the most part, the most popular indie games have a relatively simple gameplay loop done well, and others fall short when they make it feel unnatural or difficult for new players to begin. Take Terraria for example. The game itself is just a sandbox with building, mining, crafting and combat, which is a pretty common type of game. But the main gameplay loop of gathering resources to prepare for bosses that scale in difficulty the more that you do, gives a really good sense of progress and feels rewarding to play, keeping you hooked and stopping it from feeling stale. Terraria is one of the first indie games to popularise that sort of gameplay loop, and it's definitely a big part of why it's one of the best selling games of all time. On the other hand, you've got Hollow Knight. Hollow Knight's gameplay has a similar style in terms of progressing through boss fights, but it does so in a completely different way. It focuses more on precise controls and skillful fights, and the main loop that keeps the game fresh is how you unlock abilities. The game almost evolves alongside you, challenging you in different ways through making you use all of the abilities to beat bosses or solve puzzles to progress. The way it starts simple and slowly eases you into more complex controls and boss fights is by far one of the coolest aspects of a game that I've seen, although sometimes it does mean it's hard to get back into if you don't play for a while. The point I'm trying to make is that both games have completely different approaches to the gameplay, yet they both work perfectly in their own way. Terraria gives you the freedom and progression of exploring a sandbox full of mystery, whereas Hollow Knight focuses on precision and honing the player's skill to accomplish bigger challenges each time. Even though they both interact with the player in different ways, they both share in the fact that their gameplay loops are satisfying from beginning to end, and regardless of anything else, that's what makes the best foundation for any successful indie game. Although it definitely helps, gameplay alone can't always keep people hooked. Getting players to come back consistently for hundreds or thousands of hours isn't something that many games manage to achieve, but when they do, there's only one way to do it: replayability. That's not to say that to be successful, a game needs a massive amount of replayability. There's plenty of games that focus on giving people one solid experience and ending, but I think for an indie game especially to have the longevity needed for a lot of developers, replayability has a key role in providing that. There's quite a few different ways indie games incorporate replayability into the gameplay loop, with one of the simplest ways being randomizers. Making every time you load into a game feel unpredictable and unique is a great way to keep players interested in a new game, since most of the excitement comes from having no way to expect what's coming next. Balatro is a perfect example of a game that thrives on randomness. Every different run you play as you strategizing about what to do with the jokers and upgrades that show up, doing what you can with the hand you're dealt, no pun intended. Card games already heavily focus on luck and chance to begin with, and Balatro just has layer upon layer of random chances that make every single run feel completely unique, while still mostly relying on the choices you make throughout. Despite sounding like a perfect way to keep people hooked on a game, randomness doesn't always work as well for other genres. You see, Balatro is a card game. It's much easier to add hundreds upon hundreds of card variations, multipliers and jokers than it is to add the same amount of different enemies and mechanics into other games, which brings me onto a certain genre that really struggles to use this type of replayability. Games like Lethal Company and Repo, which dominated the Steam charts on release, seem to fall into irrelevancy pretty quickly considering that they used randomness throughout. Things like enemy spawns and map layouts in these games are all randomised, however they just lack the amount of content, since adding new enemies and levels is incredibly difficult for indie game developers to keep up with. I'm not saying it's the developer's fault by any means, it's just a flaw of the genre, and a good example of how using randomness to give a game replayability isn't always the best fix to keep players long term. Given that these types of games are a lot more complex to make than many others, it also means that the randomness can occasionally make the odds completely stacked against you, sometimes just annoying people rather than making them excited to play another round when they lose to something completely out of their control. Replayability doesn't just come in the form of randomness though. Luckily there's plenty of other ways to make a game keep people engaged long term. For example, Risk of Rain 2, one of my personal favourites, makes use of scale in difficulty and progression to keep people playing. You start small, with a few items and enemies dotted about that you have to beat, but every stage ramps up the difficulty until it becomes absolute chaos. How far you get into each run is determined completely by how well you've adapted with the items available, and that difficulty ramp always changes and keeps people coming back for more. Risk of Rain 2 definitely fits into the genre of roguelike games, a genre that's perfected this type of progression, with many of the games gathering a cult following from the seemingly endless replayability they have through trial and error. Of course, there is elements of randomness too, but these games use both methods hand in hand to create a good balance of challenging yet fair gameplay. Whether it's through skill-based progression systems or a randomizer, replayability is a powerful tool for indie games to keep a long-term fan base, at least when it's used correctly. Obviously, not every game needs to be infinitely replayable to be memorable. In fact, Risk of Rain 2 had another trick up its sleeve that was arguably a lot more important to make it explode in popularity: its soundtrack. Soundtracks can be just as important as mechanics in making a game unforgettable. I mentioned in my last video that Katamari Damacy is a perfect example of video game music that stood the test of time, but there's only one issue: it's not an indie game. However, there was a certain someone in the background of one clip from a game that does have great music, and is an indie game. That's right, Undertale. I know, every video about indie games ever has talked in detail about Undertale, but in all honesty it is a perfect example of how music can entirely define the identity of a game. If you can find me a single indie game video that doesn't mention Undertale, I'll give you, I don't know, maybe a firm handshake or something. Anyway, the reason its music is so good is because it perfectly complements the tone of what's happening in-game. Snowdin Town has a nice, relaxed theme matching the vibe of the area, whereas Bone Trussell tells you how goofy and silly Papyrus's character is, without even needing to see him say anything. That link makes Undertale's soundtrack feel like so much more than just background music. It feels like half the experience when you're playing it. Because of how connected some of the characters are to their themes, even something as simple as one note is memorable enough to make you think of a specific character. It's not always just about giving characters their own silly theme song either. Songs like Hopes and Dreams or His Theme hold a lot of emotional weight through being either bittersweet or uplifting, and it gives such a satisfying parallel to whatever you're doing in the game's story. In a way, Undertale's soundtrack doesn't just make the story better, it is the story told through some well thought out and meaningful pieces. Don't worry, I'm not going to keep talking about Undertale for the next 3 hours, you can put the tab back in full screen, but I think it is important to note how impactful a great soundtrack can be for a game. Indie games might not always have the biggest budgets or a large team working on them, but having a soundtrack that's created with so much care and passion like Toby Fox has done for Undertale is something that can make an indie game go from a fun experience to a really memorable game. I know that music can have a big influence on how people perceive the story of games that they play, but I think it's about time we talk about the impact the story itself can have. When I talk about story when it comes to indie games, I'm not talking about big cinematics or long cutscenes. In fact, a lot of indie games manage to make the story feel a lot more personal and driven by the player than AAA games do. I don't think I can quite fully explain what I mean without at least mentioning the inevitable. You've probably seen plenty of comments all over TikTok or YouTube telling you to play Outer Wilds, and after giving it a chance myself, I can't believe I didn't try it sooner. I won't spoil anything, since the story is the main reason to play the game, but if you have played it, you'll know exactly why I'm talking about it. This game's story isn't really something that you're told. It's more like a collection of memories that slowly pieces together a puzzle that's full of depth and surprises. With every small piece of information you get, it feels like you're slowly unravelling a huge mystery that you've solved on your own. In a way, the game leaves you to your own devices to connect the dots and discover what the story is, while stuck in a 20-minute time loop without too much guidance or help. Something that's absolutely mind-blowing about this game is that it's succeeded without being replayable at all. If you've played it before or know what happens, you could easily beat it in 20 minutes, despite the story being hours and hours long, told through a detailed exploration of different connected planets. On the complete opposite end of the spectrum, there's indie games such as A Short Hike, which rather than being a mystery you solve on a cosmic scale, is a much smaller, more personal experience. The story focuses on a bird having a wander around an island, slowly climbing a mountain and talking to strangers along the way. There's not really any grand reveal at the end or bad guys that you defeat, but that's the whole purpose. The story focuses around taking a lot from the little moments, like helping people find lost items, or listening in on conversations, which sounds pretty dull if you're looking for an action game, but it honestly feels so refreshing to play. What makes it so well done is the fact that it almost feels real, with simple characters done really well that have their own little personalities and gimmicks that you tend not to think about in everyday life. The game makes an effort to prove that small, friendly connections can all add up to something more meaningful, and that sometimes there doesn't need to be one big dramatic event in a game to leave an impression on the people who play it. And I think that's what makes story such a powerful element for making an indie game good. Although it can be a really complex story with mysteries and puzzles, it doesn't always have to be, and that's the beauty of storytelling. As long as it connects with the players on a personal level, it can become an unforgettable game. For the final of the 5 areas I wanted to talk about, I asked you guys for your suggestions on what your favourite indie games are and why. If you want to get involved in future videos or maybe get updates about upcoming content, make sure to subscribe and have notifications on so you can see my YouTube posts. Anyway, one game that particularly stood out to me for art style was suggested by this guy, and it's called Katana Zero. Something that I think it's important to mention when it comes to the art style of indie games is that it's the first impression you get of the game before you even buy it. Having a distinct art style helps games to stand out in saturated markets, and I think Katana Zero manages to do that really well. The game puts you into a world made up of a gritty pixel art cyberpunk aesthetic with all sorts of different backgrounds and locations that sets such a great atmosphere to complement the story and gameplay. It uses like an old school VHS look and pixel art, which you'd think would limit it graphically, but instead it's got some great contrasting colours, really smooth animation and beautiful lighting. Everything about this game felt so pleasing to the eye, and even things like using the time slow ability looks amazing. Katana Zero is a good example of how an indie game's flashy art style and quality animation can lead to it being successful, but there's plenty of other games with more comforting art styles that became really popular too. For example, Stardew Valley is pretty much the polar opposite of Katana Zero in every way possible aside from the pixel art. It's a game that reignited people's love for farming simulators and started a huge wave of cozy games that are a relatively new major genre of game. Stardew focuses heavily on making sure that the player feels comfortable and relaxed in the environment, with friendly looking sprites and residents that make you feel as though you're at home whilst you're playing. A big part of making you feel at home is that the game is just nice to look at. The colours of the environment change with each season, and all the little details make you able to play for hours without feeling overwhelmed by intense or fast-paced graphics. It's simplistic yet beautiful, which matches the tone of the gameplay really well, and just feels inviting to spend time in that world. Much like music, the art style can be used to improve the experience alongside both the story and gameplay, whilst also being a memorable component of a successful game. But unlike the music or story, you don't even need to have played the game to see the art style. Before you even hear the first song or play a second of the game, the art style is the first thing that makes you even consider clicking on or buying that game. As well as being a great way to complement a solid story, having a great art style can be make or break for an indie game, deciding whether it stands out against others or just blends into other games in the same genre. All in all, I think that all of the elements I mentioned can be really important in making an indie game good. But there's more to it than that. Originally, I was going to say something along the lines of a good mix of all aspects makes for a well-rounded game that people will enjoy. And although that's true to some extent, I came to the realisation that that's not always the case. An indie game that really excels in just one or two areas can be equally, if not more successful than others that are decent at all of them, and it's really up to the developers to decide which areas they want to focus on. The main advantage that indie developers have over AAA developers is the fact that they're a smaller team, or even just an individual who's really passionate about their project. They can choose exactly which parts of their game they want people to resonate and connect with, and the heart they put into making that area special is exactly what makes an indie game good. It's not every aspect that makes a game good, but it definitely can be any aspect. Whether it's the music, the story, the gameplay, the art style, or even things I didn't mention like comedy or characters, whatever the developer really cares about when making their game usually becomes the area that brings it that success, and can be considered the thing that makes their indie game good. My name is Joester, and that pretty much sums up my thoughts on what I believe makes an indie game good. Thank you so much for watching, don't forget to subscribe. See ya!